The earliest memory I have is our parents and friends and neighbors teaching us about what we should do and what we shouldn't do. We had to make sure that we behaved in certain ways. And there was a different world, black and white world. If we walked down the sidewalk and a white man was coming toward us, we had to look down upon the ground. And if a white woman walked down our same sidewalk, we would have to walk out in the street. Couldn't walk down the same sidewalk. We couldn't ride in the front of the buses. We couldn't use certain facilities, restrooms, and different things around town. If we wanted to go and buy a pair of shoes or clothing, they could only hold the shoe up. We couldn't try them on. We couldn't try on a cap.
Today we will learn how segregation affected the Black communities of Columbus. In 2020, Leila Asher examined historical redlining maps in Columbus, Ohio. She discovered that they align with present-day areas with greater levels of community vulnerability to disasters like COVID-19. Including factors like poverty, disability, and a lack of health insurance. These factors, she writes, has led Columbus City Council to declare that racism is a public health crisis.
It really does become racism. Racism is the core of this. And so when you think about on June 1st, my council colleagues support the resolution declaring racism as a public health crisis. And I'm so thankful that they all supported this resolution.
In 2018, we started to ask ourselves as a Board of Commission, what were the issues that were driving the growth of poverty in Central Ohio? We became the largest county in Ohio, and what we were seeing, and by all accounts and measures, we're one of the more prosperous counties. And we were seeing growth in nearly every category. Our unemployment rate was at an all-time low, and you can see there was a crane in the sky in nearly every part of town in Central Ohio. Yet we were also seeing poverty growing in a very significant way. And we did heat maps to really illustrate the patterns of growth of poverty. When we started to peel back the layers, and we spent the better part of a year meeting with, and this wasn't staff or just the consultants, the three commissioners, we were there for every meeting, rolling up our sleeves, going back and forth. But when we started to peel back the layers, I'll make this short, what we saw embedded in nearly every category was of measuring quality of life, affordable housing, access to quality health care, access to good education, all of these social determinants of health. The underlying and consistent element that we saw was racism.
Redlining was a practice beginning in the 1930s, which denied home loans to anyone who lived in predominantly Black neighborhoods. This effectively shut Black communities out of the middle class and perpetuated segregation. This would end up affecting the wealth and the health of these communities for generations. Attorney Morgan Harper said in Columbus, many of the city's issues are connected to historical policy. Now let's hear more from Attorney Harper.
And what's interesting in Columbus too is just how recent a lot of that history is. So, I actually met someone during the campaign that I just completed who remembered the neighborhood I grew up in, Berwick, on the east side, when it was almost entirely a Jewish and white neighborhood. And he remembers the day that a Black family moved in. And that's when they had a visit the next day from a real estate agent. It was like, when are you gonna move? Are you ready to move yet? And as you probably know, at this point, that's a predominantly Black neighborhood, though it also has some shifting demographics going on. But that's when white people, a few years after that, stopped going to Columbus City schools on that side of town, more or less, right? So, a lot of these things are connected to historic policy decisions that were intentionally made. I think what is unique about Columbus, even though we see this across the country, is just how close by a lot of these communities are and the differences in outcomes. That you can just go down Main Street for a 10-minute drive and enter and exit and enter again, very different worlds.
Right.
So that to me has always been a little bit of the peculiar thing about Central Ohio and just the collection of suburbs and different school districts and how much that drives the opportunity that people have.
I'm standing at one of the locations where the red dot sat on the redlining map in 1936, eventually dividing this Black professional community in half.
Redlining was how structural racism was designed into cities, and the city of Columbus was not exempt from these practices.
My dad was a retired military veteran and ended up moving to Columbus from West Virginia after he got out of World War II, and he had $3,000 saved from his military days to buy an $8,000 house, but no bank would finance $5,000.
My mother can recall in the 1950s sitting on the steps of her great-grandparents' home, hearing about the construction of the freeway and thinking how sad it's going to be to scatter the community.
Teaching Columbus said Hanford was founded as a separate village in 1909 and became majority African American during the Great Migration. The George Washington Carver subdivision of Hanford that sat between Main Street and Livingston Avenue and Alum Creek Drive and Nelson Road was established in 1946 to meet the post-war housing demand. The Carver subdivision was marketed to returning African American soldiers. Many of the original homeowners were Tuskegee Airmen who were stationed at nearby Lockbourne Air Force Base. When Interstate 70 came through Columbus in the 1960s, many homes in Hanford Village were eliminated. Only a few houses remained on the site of Hanford adjacent to the famous Hanford Park. Shirley Mixon had a childhood right out of a book about the 1950s suburbia. She said no one worried about leaving doors unlocked or bikes unattended. People took pride in their homes and even had contests for the best kept lawn. Children played outside and neighbors shared plates of food at dinner time. Hanford became a predominantly Black municipality by the 1920s and had its own mayor and police department. It was actually annexed to Columbus in 1955.
I can take you back when I was born out here down at Old Hanford. We had an Old Hanford and a New Hanford. So I was born down in Old Hanford, and then my mother and father bought the house up here in New Hanford when I was 9 months old, I think it was, 9 months old. And only thing I can remember is that this neighborhood was built for the Black airmen out at Lockbourne Air Force Base because what was told to me, they didn't want them staying out at the base. So they built this community out here. And we had our own fire department, had our own mayor, and we had our own police department. Had our own store, and in the store, there was a barber and a beautician. Well, growing up, there was quite a few kids that lived out here, out here in Old Hanford and New Hanford. I would say almost every house had about 4 or 5 kids, to a house. So we played with the people on our street. And we did that up until the freeway came through. And it just cut off. I lost a lot of friends. To me, I was hurt because, like I said, I lost my friends. On the street I lived on, Bowman, there's only 4 houses left. I want to say, well, you're going to make me count. Oh, my. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I want to say they took about 12 or 13 houses off that street. I'm just going to give you a round figure. They didn't have to take our houses. That's. I think they really could have went on the other side of the creek, which was Bexley. And I don't think there was any houses or anything there, if I remember. Because I remember that if I can remember right, I don't think they even had a choice to even vote on it or to stop it. Only thing we know, it had came through. As much as I can remember, they didn't give us a choice. I believe that if the freeway hadn't came through here, that maybe a lot of the young people would have took their parents' house, and it would still be, we was like a family knit, close-knit family, a community. Matter of fact, I can see them now, and we'll speak and hug. And the only thing, the people that are still here that I know that are older, like Mr. Miller across the street, and Mr. Bolden, he was one of the first ones that's moved out here. We just still like family.
Although Mikeson had a wonderful childhood experience growing up here in Hanford Village, that wasn't always the conversation when it came to Black communities. Redlining and policies affected the Black communities of Columbus. Jason Reese, Ohio State University assistant professor and urban planner, said you can't imagine what happens to Black neighborhoods without the power of prejudice and discrimination. There are many routes a city can take. Still, Columbus seems to always exclusively target Black communities. In addition to redlining, the practice of denying home loans and other resources to Black neighborhoods during segregation, the government also targets the communities for urban renewal.
We lost thousands of people in that time of urban renewal. And for us in this area, it was called urban removal, because people were moved out. Lowendick tore down 110 acres of housing in the area, which is north of here by Atchison, the Mount Vernon Plaza. All that was housing. And that all came down 110 acres.
Retired journalist Ann B. Walker said that there was successful businesses, bars, and music venues on Mount Vernon Avenue and Long Street. There was always camaraderie. Walker said her backyard was a recreational hub for the neighborhood kids. But then the construction of I-71 divided and destroyed much of Bronzeville, and the Walkers were forced to give up their home. We didn't have a choice, she said. We had to either sell or let the city take it. Many of us felt we were not getting the full value for our home. The Walkers sold for just a couple of thousands more than what they paid for the house.
Any kind of control is when you can get someone to do what you want them to do without putting a gun to their head. That they self-impose the oppression or the fear, that they just get up and leave. And that's the power of eminent domain without having to take someone to court, is the belief that you can't take it on. Now, those who would have taken them to court probably would have, had a long road, but they would have gotten probably more. But the realtors at that time was the ones doing all the tricks with the people.
The greatest negative impact of the destruction on Hanford Village was on the older residents. George Holloman of 724 Bowman Avenue said many of the families in the old village had moved there in the early 1920s. So you had multi-generational families living in separate households on the same street. Families were split. Lifetime friends were moving to various parts of Columbus. And remember the new village. The homes were built for returning servicemen and their families. They had only been in those houses for less than a generation, and they were being torn down. They had endured discrimination in the service, fought for our country, and now they were being displaced.
So you had three successions of things that tore the place apart, of people. With the Brown versus the Board of Education, then the Highways Act, and then urban renewal. So by the 60s, the place was decimated. People were moving and running. And what was more important was that people took not only their families, but they took their resources. So now the local businesses suffered because they didn't have the people that they were catering to bring the monies here. So again, that whole process of when we're coming into a neighborhood and we throw out there that we're the government, we're urban renewal, it can be implemented in many ways. And here, it was just the fear and thought of this is what is going to happen if you don't move. And as a result of that, a lot of families are broken up, and we still haven't recovered.
Area, and the schools were so far away, and there were no buses, and we literally had to walk miles just to get to school, you know. I mean, and you're going into neighborhoods that are not safe, and many times we had dogs sick on us.
And I can remember my father wanting to buy a house on the hilltop. He went to the bank and they told him, well, you can buy, we will find a mortgage, you can get a mortgage for a house, but it has to be on the south side of Broad Street. And he wasn't allowed to get a mortgage on the north side of Broad Street because that was all a white area.
You're talking about housing, you're talking about jobs, you're talking about all of these things. It's like, well, yeah, if this is our fundamental issue as a country, economic segregation, income and wealth inequality, then there are a lot of things, a lot of policies that have to change to address that.
We had, segregated housing where you weren't allowed to buy houses outside of a certain area, restrictive covenants, messages in the lease that you would sign if you wanted to buy a house that said you were not going to sell to anyone not of the white race.
A lot of challenges, from racial inequality, economic inequality, the climate crisis, and we know that housing is a major issue, especially when it comes to affordable housing. And so we can't just see the policies of the past like redlining and not also look at policies like exclusionary zoning practices that continue to keep communities divided. And ultimately, if we want to have a growing multiracial democracy in which all people can thrive, we have to ensure that people have places to live safely and securely and have the economic security to be successful and to live up to their full potential.
And the conversation continues. Countless organizations and leadership initiatives bring the topic of segregation to the discussion. However, the constant reminder of systemic processes established by the city remains a continual struggle to reverse. The discrimination and hatred borrowed from our past have been replaced with systems, laws, policies, and orders rooted in the same ignorance. As a community leader, I'm privileged to hear the woes of unfair housing practices and lending, not to mention less than fair home evaluations. I hear the hurts of higher interest rates, taxes, and the discrimination of realtors. The stories I've listened to grow every day. A single line in a speech given 60 years ago in 1963 reminds us of how Americans view segregation. Segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever is remembered as one of the loudest cries against racial equality in American history. Governor George Wallace said this during his inaugural speech in Montgomery, Alabama. James L. Poe Jr., who was a former student activist and then president of Montgomery chapter of the NAACP, says blacks were not invited to attend the event. See, Governor Wallace is one example of a national figure that didn't want racial equality in America. But in the city of Columbus, unfortunately, it wasn't much different. It was always a known culture in Columbus that the black community was tolerated as a need. And the fewer blacks, the better the city would grow.